United States Army presents The Big Picture, an official report produced for the armed forces and the American people. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Sergeant Stuart Queen.
"100 years ago, a momentous event occurred. Known to historians as the tragic war of brother against brother, the Civil War became one of the darkest moments in our history. Out of this period, we have selected two stories to show you. The first is called Mathew Brady. Brady was the first pictorial historian of any war, and his pictures live on today to recall yesterday's history. The second story is called Clara Barton, and shows a segment from the life of a dedicated woman during the Civil War. Now, let's go back through history with Mathew Brady.
The camera's eye. The magic eye that captures and holds a moment's action, a pinpoint in time. Today, the camera serves an ever-expanding field of uses, familiar to all servicemen. And yet, for most of us, photography appeals by fixing permanently chapters in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. But there was a day before the high-speed precision instrument, a day of crude wooden box cameras. Fortunately for us, it was also a day when a small group of pioneers with imagination foresaw the possibilities of that magic eye. Mathew Brady, a young New York State farm boy, was chief among those enthusiasts in the newly born art. In addition to his own work, Brady collected the prints of others, building a pictorial record of our American past. The nation's capital, in an era of unpaved dirt streets and horse-drawn vehicles. Replacing that earlier White House destroyed in the War of 1812 was the handsome new home of our presidents. When we speak of those past presidents, their faces are familiar. John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson. Their faces were made familiar through the work of Mathew Brady. Preserved for us, too, are those early writers, pride of our growing national culture. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Washington Irving, the beloved poet Walt Whitman. And what schoolboy doesn't know the faces of our statesmen? Henry Clay, John Calhoun, Daniel Webster, men who shaped and guided our young republic. They built well, but soon within the country's capital, still awaiting the completion of the now familiar dome, the storm clouds of the slavery issue threatened national unity. As the crisis sharpened, Brady saw a new use for the camera. Abraham Lincoln, whom Brady had photographed as a young congressman from Illinois, now sat in Washington as president of the divided nation. From him, Brady received permission to make a record of the war that could not be held back. "We are coming, Father Abraham." So sang the volunteer units, responding to Lincoln's call to arms. Hastily constructed camps sprang up, crude and comfortless by today's standards. The growing manpower had to be supplied and equipped, furnished with the weapons needed to fight this country's bloodiest war. The means to move those masses of supplies and equipment were organized and assembled. This was a day before the phrase motor pool had been coined. Old Dobbin was the hay-powered engine that turned the wheels of war. The now middle-aged Brady and his assistants recorded all. "What is it, wagons?" was the name soldiers gave to the mysterious horse-drawn photo labs that Brady sent into the field. The clumsy contraptions were to become a familiar sight wherever men were mustered and trained. Training then meant the inevitable close-order drill, but also long-forgotten formations, such as the hollow square defense against cavalry attack. The cigarette had not yet been invented, but the civilian-turned-soldier took 10 and welcomed that brief break from duty. Preparation has its own grim ends. The conflict flared into full flame, and presently the capital itself had to fling up hasty defenses against sudden and determined attack. War, now in full violence, was being carried to our inland waters as well as on the high seas. The nation's shipyards were turning out newer, more effective gunboats. For the first time, naval warfare saw revolutionary new ships sheathed in armor. The expanding Navy had ceased to be the property of the New England states with their deeply rooted seafaring traditions. Men and more men were needed, and they came from inland cities and the western plains. Mechanic and farmer proved they too could develop sea legs and man a 40-pounder. Mere boys were enlisted too, youngsters who could run powder to the waiting gun crews. The awakening sciences of the century found uses on the battlefield. The telegraph corps, from which emerged today's signal corps, brought new speed into communications. So highly technical was their work considered that even linesmen were often civilian technicians. Born, too, was warfare's first venture into the skies. Balloon reconnaissance was employed to spot enemy batteries. The balloon was frequently set adrift in the belief that a favorable breeze would carry it back. Sometimes it did. Of civilian origin was the publicly endowed United States Sanitary Commission. One day it would evolve into our present American Red Cross. The tragic aspects of all wars, past and future, were soon evident. This was Richmond, Virginia, Charleston, Fredericksburg. War meant, too, the uprooted, the homeless refugee, the prisoner of war doomed to a captivity under subhuman conditions. These were the wounded in an era when the trifling flesh wound would lead to gangrene and amputation. When hospitals were few and far behind the lines. Finally, war meant those who would fight no more. So ended 483,000 Americans, North and South, a total not even reached in World War II. What do we know of the day-to-day life of the man who served? Well, like his counterpart today, he lived in countless company streets, Winter quarters were crude log shacks built by himself. He knew fatigue and details, and he killed boredom in his own way and polished up before endless inspections and reviews. When and where possible, he enjoyed rare visits from family and friends. There was no handy PX, but licensed tradesmen called sutlers set up shop and even followed the troops into the field and on their campaigns. Great-grandpa posed for photos to send to his girl back home. Sent his folks a picture of the outfit, too, and his own buddies. Like today, there was always one comic, one clown. The serviceman of that far-off day carried his faith into the field. Doubtless he prayed for survival and for the war's end. It came at Appomattox with the collapse of the Confederacy and General Lee's surrender to General Grant. Yes, peace came, but only after battlefields like Gettysburg had immortalized in blood the courage of brother ranged against brother. Gettysburg, where a parade and now forgotten ceremonies introduced a never-to-be-forgotten address by the war-weary Lincoln. Within 2 years, the president dedicated to binding the nation's wounds was shot down by the assassin John Wilkes Booth. The camera brings us Ford's Theater, the final scene, and the presidential box where the tragedy struck. It brings us to the actress Laura Keene, the last person on whom the unsuspecting president's gaze rested. It has even preserved for us the 21-year-old Dr. Leal, who emerged from the horror-stricken crowd to attend the dying Lincoln. An era had ended, the first, but not the last, to be seen through the magic eye of the camera. The pages of our history, with new pages yet to be added, all our yesterdays, are preserved for generations to come. For this achievement, a major share of our gratitude must rest with the man whose foresight made it possible. Earliest of American combat photographers, he lived to within 4 years of our own century. The pioneer, Mathew Brady.
Clara Barton is famous in history today as the founder of the American Red Cross. To the wounded soldiers of the Civil War, both the blue and the gray, however, she was remembered as the angel of mercy who fed them and treated their wounds. She had no official standing. She received no money for her services. Yet this dedicated woman devoted her life to the cause of humanity.
It was the fall of 1862. For more than a year, the Civil War had raged, and the Union Army of the Potomac had known only a series of sharp defeats. Casualties were high, and the means of caring for them tragically inadequate. Hundreds who could have been saved died in the field for lack of proper care. Already a part of history were the battles which we know as Bull Run, the 7 Days, and Jackson's Valley Campaign. Each had been a costly failure for the Union forces, and in the North, people began to wonder if the South could be defeated and the Union preserved. In the most tragic and bitterly punitive fighting our nation has ever known, American fought against American, and the casualty lists for both sides skyrocketed, as on American hills and in American valleys, cannon and musket flung their hot metal among the men and horses of both sides. The spectacle of suffering was piteous, perhaps especially so to Clara Barton, for she decided to do something about it. The already spare face of the man in the White House seemed to grow even more gaunt under a constant flood of criticism and urgent demands for an early end to the war. General Robert E. Lee did not help the situation, as south of the Potomac, he added a measure to the legend of his invincibility by routing a vastly superior Union force at Manassas Junction. General John Pope, who commanded the Union forces at Manassas, was simply outgeneraled and outfought by Lee's troops under the immediate leadership of Stonewall Jackson. Flushed with repeated successes and confident of their own destiny, Lee's forces boldly took the offensive. Word was flashed to Washington that the Army of Virginia was invading the North. Speculation and rumor began to whisper that the end of the war was in sight. As the threat to Washington grew, Lincoln sent word to nearby Alexandria, an urgent call to the ex-general-in-chief of the Union Army. General George McClellan had been in disgrace after his Peninsular campaign. Now Lincoln summoned him back. His orders: stop Lee at all costs. Those costs were to be high. On September 17, 1862, Union and Confederate forces would meet at Antietam Creek near the towns of Sharpsburg and Hagerstown, Maryland. More than 100,000 men would be involved in the bloody Battle of Antietam. And one woman, Clara Barton, would carve for herself a unique place in the annals of service to mankind. The day the battle began, however, she was just a dedicated woman, driving a wagon loaded with provisions across the rolling Maryland countryside. Years later, she would recall that day of blood and anguish and retell it in her own words.
With my attendant, I sought the hilltops, and as the mist cleared away and the morning sun broke over the Maryland heights, its rays fell upon the dusty forms of dying men. Many of you may never hear the bugle notes which call men to battle, but if, like us, you had heard them that grim September morning as they rang through the valley and echoed from the 100 hills, they would have lingered in your ears as they do in mine. The battle had commenced on the right, and thinking our place might be there, we had been following the army since dawn. For the last 8 miles, we could trace its course by the broken bodies of the wounded who rested along the roadside. Turning into a cornfield near a house and barn, we stopped in the rear of the last gun. Judging that surgeons must be operating there, I took my arms full of stimulants and bandages and approached the house. The smell of death hung heavy in the yard. A table stood on the porch with a wounded man lying on it, a surgeon working over him with the most rudimentary equipment. There I came face to face with one of the kindest, noblest doctors I have ever known, Dr. Dunn of Cannottville, Pennsylvania. I quickly learned of his difficulties. They had not a bandage, rag, lint, or string, and all around him, shell-wounded men were bleeding to death. With a great joy, I laid my precious burden down among them and thought that never before had linen looked so white. Determined to set up aid in the yard, I told him of my needs, and he dispatched a soldier to help me with the unloading of supplies. There was a spring house in the yard, and I decided to use this as my headquarters. My instructions were to unload the provisions and place them inside for the ordeal that was to follow. We had met wounded men walking or being carried to the rear for the last 2 miles, but around the barn there lay the men who were too badly wounded to admit removal. Some 300 had collected already, and it was scarcely 10 o'clock. The echo of the guns promised there would be many more. My first act on the field taught me the real tragedy of battle. A man called to me for a drink. I stopped to give it, and having raised him in my arms, was holding him. He fell back, dead. A bullet had sped between us, tearing a hole in my sleeve and burying itself in his body. There was no more to be done for him, and I left him to his rest. I have never mended that hole in my sleeve, and I wonder if a soldier ever does mend a bullet hole in his coat. The patient endurance of these men was astonishing. By the wooden fence, a soldier lay with a ball lodged in the bones of his cheek. I told him I would go for the surgeon, but he caught my arm. "They can't come for me now," he said. "I have to wait my turn. Please, you take the ball out for me." This was a new call. I had never severed the nerves and fibers of the human flesh, but I could not withstand his entreaties. Nearby lay a sergeant from Illinois with a bullet directly through both his legs. When he saw that I had no way of supporting the soldier's head, he shoved himself along the ground with a desperate effort and took the wounded man's head in his hands. I do not think a surgeon would have pronounced it a scientific operation. The doctor suffered almost as much as the patient, but from the relief the man had from his pain, I dared to hope it was successful. Three times that day the ground was contested, lost, and won, and each time it brought hundreds of wounded from the field to our crowded ground. Each had to be aided, and each drained our supplies to the danger mark. At 2 o'clock, an attendant came to tell me that the last loaf of bread had been cut and the last cracker pounded. We had 3 boxes of wine still unopened. What should they do? "Open the wine and give them that," I said, and God help us. The next instant brought a shout from Sergeant Fields, who had opened the first box. Of 12 boxes of wine which we carried, the first 9 were packed in sawdust. These last 3, when all else was gone, were found to be packed in Indian corn meal. A woman does not hesitate long under such circumstances. There was a fireplace in the spring house. Kettles were picked up and set over the fire, and as quickly as I tell it, I was mixing water and meal for gruel. All the day, my men carried buckets of hot gruel for miles down the line to the wounded and dying where they fell. Food was given both North and South alike, recognizing the need, not the uniform. Never again was I to experience such a sensation of wealth and competency. We fed hundreds that day. For many, it was the first meal since the guns of battle exploded that morning. For many, it provided the will and the strength to endure their pain. Twilight began to descend, and there were still many to be tended. For the first time since I arrived, I saw Dr. Dunn stop work and stand alone in the darkness. "You look tired, Doctor," I said. Yes, he was tired. Tired of neglect and heartlessness. Here were hundreds of men to be operated on, and there was no light to work by. It was then that I called for the lanterns I had brought in the wagons. He looked at me, saying little, but his eyes reflected his gratitude. Through the long starlit night, we worked and hoped and prayed. The lights were never snuffed and the tables were never empty. To some we could promise repair and hope. All we could give to others was a comfortable place to die. Men died that night, slowly and with full realization that life was ebbing out of them. It was to be a Northern victory, but the victory was costly for both sides. While the guns grew silent, the sounds of tortured men filled the air as an encore of battle. How does one measure victory? Antietam was a victory for the Union. Her cannon remained on the field while the foe retreated across the river. The high tide of the Confederacy was turned back. The Emancipation Proclamation was born. But to me, the real victory, the real courage of that memorable day was the endurance of all the soldiers to the greatest physical agony and mental anguish, the greatest inhumanity that man can create for man. To them belongs the honor, the memory, the triumph of that day.